All right, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to Abigail, Catherine, and Emma.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kate. So to start by framing our research, we wanted to talk about how over the years we've seen an increase in the percentage of Americans that accept climate change, which is in this graph in the middle in gray. However, when you separate these responses by party lines, you see that the acceptance of climate change is becoming more and more partisan, with Republicans being usually less accepting of climate change. Next slide. Related to this, we've seen that news coverage overall of global warming plus climate change, which is these two terms on this chart here together from some larger news sources, is increasing, which is great. And on this graph, in the bubble numbers, we've overlaid some events, such as the release of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth or Trump being elected, that have been the most covered, if not the most significant events related to climate change. But this data is from larger news sources like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and we don't have a lot of information about how local news is covering climate change. So it's important to hear from local sources because, as Kate mentioned, they are often trusted more, especially among Republicans. So it's a really important demographic to target. And there's a wealth of information on how to talk about climate change in ways that empower people to take action, such as framing it locally, connecting it to people's values, or emphasizing what they could gain rather than what they could lose. So our research goals were to understand not only the amount of coverage going on in local newspapers, but also the messaging strategies related to climate change. And with that, Emma will go into our main research questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Abigail. So as Abigail mentioned and Kate mentioned prior to this, we took a look at 3 major research questions, diving into coverage, tone, and frameworks. And overall, we were really interested in looking at how news coverage around climate change is portrayed and if there were any disparities between the different regions across the US. Breaking those down even further, the 4 of us took a look at 3 states, Michigan, Arizona, and North Carolina, and also took a look at 3 newspapers within each of those states. And as you can see, each of our research questions was further broken down into common terms, stakeholders, word associations, tone, topic frameworks, and solutions. And we leveraged newspapers.com and LexisNexis to be able to develop some of this data and analyze it.
So starting off with one of our first overarching questions, we were curious to see how coverage of climate change and global warming changed over time. And one really surprising take-home message that we found was that in general, there was a drop-off in the number of results for climate change and global warming searches from the period of 2011 to 2015. So this graph, each bar represents a newspaper and they're color-coded by state. And then you can see some of that time period and some of the surrounding time periods around it. And then on the y-axis, it's the number of results that we got from our search. So although those bars were pretty big in the 2006 to 2010, comparatively then we see from 2011 to 2015, they're much smaller, and there hasn't been much of an improvement in the 2016 to 2020. So in contrast to some of those larger newspapers where we're seeing an overall rising trend in coverage of climate change and global warming, we're not quite seeing this bounce back in local newspapers after this lull. And although we can't conclude why there is a lull in coverage, talking amongst ourselves, we are interested and feel that it might be tied to the changing presidential regime from a Republican to a Democratic. And potentially there might be a sense of complacency with a Democratic president who is more apt to take action on climate change, that maybe people were feeling like they didn't need to keep talking about it. So that's something we definitely want to look into further, but was a really interesting trend that we noticed. And now moving on, we saw some really interesting trends in the types of topics which were popular in different decades related to climate change news. So in the 1980s, we see a surge in environmental topics like greenhouse effect. So really focused on the science, which kind of reflected the growing public awareness of climate change and not really understanding what it was. And so on each of these graphs, you can see the years are growing across the bottom, and the years are also color coded to make it a little easier to see. And they're separated for each of the 3 states that we looked at. And then on the y-axis, it's the number of search results for that specific term. So you'll see in the graph on the left, greenhouse effect kind of peaked in that purple kind of bar from 1986 to 1990. And then moving on to the 1990s, we see kind of a shift towards more emotional terms in the way that climate change is being discussed. So topics like endangered species, environmental destruction, Mother Earth, these are some of the more popular terms that we're seeing in the 1990s. So that's kind of the pink and brown bars is where those are tending to peak in the 1990s. And moving on to the 2000s, we see an emphasis on actionable terms. So things like renewable resources, sustainability. So the literature is starting to reflect a sense of people can take action on climate change. So overall, we see that there are different kind of subsections of climate change which are popular in different decades, and we are able to kind of parse out some of those patterns from the local newspapers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Abigail to talk about how the coverage of climate change and global warming stakeholders has changed over these same time periods.
All right, thank you, Kat. So we wanted to investigate not only the frequency of terms related to climate change, but also how local media is talking about the players involved in climate change. So framing of climate change stakeholders we found is mostly positive. So there's been an increase in the use of the terms global warming activist and climate change activist, and a decrease in terms like alarmist and skeptic across all states in recent years relative to that early 2000 spike, which you can see here, negative connotations like more in the middle and on the right-hand side. We have seen a bit of an uptick in terms like climate change or global warming denialist, which could be due to some of our current media climate. But the majority of discourse is focused on global warming and climate change scientist, which is the really large graphs you see here towards the right-hand side, since 2006 and 2010, which is probably who we should be listening to and talking about in relation to climate change and global warming discourse. All right. And so we wanted to look at not only how often are certain terms being represented, but also how they're being talked about. So this will be our next research topic on tone in the media. So we looked at a set of loaded terms with both positive and negative associations, positive being things like scientific is real, is a threat, and negative connotations like scam, hoax, joke associated with both climate change, which are the graphs on the top, and global warming, which are the graphs on the bottom. And so it's interesting to see in areas like Michigan and Arizona, positive connotations like is real, scientific solutions, and threat peak for global warming around the mid-2000s, and then these same connotations for climate change are steadily increasing, which matches what we see with overall trends of the use of the term global warming and climate change, where global warming is kind of going by the wayside and climate change is what's being more frequently used now in the media. There has been a slight uptick in negative connotations for things like hoax and joke in recent years, which again could be due to this media phenomena of fake news going on, but this is largely overshadowed by use of positive language like is real, scientific, and solutions, which is really positive to see from local media news sources. And continuing on with our question of the tone of coverage in local news media, we also coded a subset of articles as positive, negative, or both sides. So positive meaning they are accepting of climate change, even if it's talking about the negative effects of climate change, and negative meaning it's got a tone of skepticism or denialism, and both sides meaning they weigh both arguments equally within the article. So we see an overall decrease in both sides in negative coverage for Michigan and Arizona. And while negative coverage and both sides coverage is still present in North Carolina in recent years, it has gone down over the years, which is really positive to see.
And for our last overarching question, we looked at the frameworks, which are the ways that they're talking about climate change and kind of what they're using to contextualize climate change. And so what we have here is a graph where it's the average percentage of articles which fell into a given category for each of the newspapers. And so we have them color coded by state, and then the size of the circle represents the average weekday circulation for that newspaper. So what we found was that overall, for both climate change and global warming results, that most articles tended to be about things like policy, environmental effects, or just the general science of how climate change works. And less commonly were national security, public health, and religion. And when you look at these, you can see in some of the topics that there is some indication of regional effects going on. For example, if you look at the global warming on the right side, and within the policy bar, you see that North Carolina, which are those blue bubbles, are kind of separated from Arizona and Michigan. And so this suggests that there may be some regional effects in terms of which framework is most popular and what they're most frequently, how they're trying to connect to their audience. Next slide. And then relatedly with these articles, we looked at whether or not they were offering solutions. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, most articles are not offering any climate change solutions. So about 70% when we're looking at articles, both that were returned for climate change and for global warming. And so they're discussing the problems, but they aren't offering any potential ways to fix those problems, which we know tends to leave people feeling overwhelmed and scared and not too interested in taking action. And when they did offer solutions, about 30% of the time, they were large scale solutions. So it was things that businesses or other bigger players could do. And very rarely were they offering any small scale solutions that would be relevant to the people reading the articles. And this, we feel, highlights a very important opportunity for local newspapers as this trusted source of local information. If they were offering localized ways to take action and localized solutions to climate change challenges in their area, it could be a really powerful way to deliver a message of taking action on climate change. And so the fact that so few newspapers were pushing these messages is definitely something that we can take action on. And again, we see some evidence in this graph of some regional variation, again, with some of the colors separating out. And we looked again at three states, and we've seen other examples of regional effects in this data. So now kind of wrapping up, we just want to take a really brief look at some of the events and scenarios that cause these different state by state results.
So first up is Arizona. So in the Arizona articles, you did see a lot of overwhelmingly positive coverage, and we think that some of the regional events going on could have influenced this is first of all the cap and trade supported by former Governor Janet Napolitano under the Obama administration, and also Arizona's early involvement in the Western Climate Initiative in 2007. In articles in Arizona on climate change, solar panels were frequently cited as an alternative revenue source to things like natural gas and coal. Arizona in particular sees the tangible effects of climate change, which could make individuals more accepting of it. So things like increased heat waves, wildfires, and water resources under stress. And additionally, University of Arizona also had some pretty prominent climate change researchers in their faculty, including Jonathan Overpeck, who shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore, which also could have really influenced the tone of articles in the region.
So in Michigan, we saw a lot of articles that were about the water levels in the Great Lakes, which people take great pride in, and the water levels are being affected to go to more extremes by climate change. We also saw coverage of the automobile industry and the positive and negative ways in which that's interacting with climate change, as Michigan is a significant automobile manufacturing, has a significant automobile industry manufacturing. And lastly, we saw a lot of articles that focused on the impacts of climate change on agriculture and outdoor recreation, as again, those are really important economic sectors here in Michigan. And lastly, in North Carolina, we had a really interesting newspaper included in our study, which was the Gaffney Ledger. And this newspaper is a 5-generation family-owned newspaper, which is in contrast to many of our other newspapers, which were often owned by the same corporations, which buy up a lot of media. But in this case, it actually allowed for them to promote ultra-conservative views. But that was a really interesting newspaper to include in our study. Also interesting for North Carolina was that they didn't discuss any intersections of climate change and hurricanes being related to one another, despite hurricanes being a really significant weather event that happens in the state. We also saw a coverage of climate solutions increase in result to Asheville, a city in North Carolina, coming up with a resiliency plan in 2016. And in 2012, there was a really controversial bill that required flooding and city planning to be based on historic levels of sea level rise, as opposed to the current science of how fast sea level is rising with climate change. And so there was a lot of conversation around that. So overall, we saw some examples of ways that local newspapers can do amazing, connective literature on climate change. And we also saw examples of how they can promote false science and create doubt where there isn't really any in the scientific community. So both of these articles are examples from that Gaffney Ledger from 2016. So we can see on one hand, they're saying there's an overblown link between hurricanes and global warming. And on the other hand, they have this really heartwarming story about first graders who built a new greenhouse at their school to learn about global warming and to grow plants themselves. So this is an example of an article which is checking all of the boxes. It's value-based, it's place-driven, it connects people right to their local community, and it's something that everybody can get behind. So taking examples like this are ways that we can move forward and hopefully advance the literature so that it continues to reflect this science-based ways of communicating about climate change.
So to sum up our project, we are planning to publish our results in Nature Climate Change. And we've seen that local news media is not the same as national news media coverage of climate change, and it isn't improving as quickly. So we've identified some areas where local news can improve, and as a source of climate change information, really appealing to values and local solutions. And so we just want to leave you guys with one warning that we saw from our results, that as we move into another blue administration, it's important that we continue to cover climate change so we don't see another drop off of coverage that we saw in that 2006-2010 range. So thank you guys very much.